The sedative is working well. He's very calm.
Good, let's get these samples quickly. The drone shows a storm approaching.
The wind screamed across the frozen expanse of Churchill, Manitoba, tearing through the silence of the tundra. On the ice lay a massive polar bear, her body trembling, her fur matted and dull, crawling with parasites that drained the very life from her veins. A few meters away, David Harper, broad-shouldered, his beard frosted by the cold, dropped to his knees, his breath cutting the air like smoke. He knew the animal's time was collapsing into minutes. Each shallow heartbeat slowed, and the ice beneath her seemed ready to claim her forever. Her chest rose in uneven spasms, every exhale a low, rattling groan. David's gloved hand hovered inches above her fur, frozen between compassion and instinctive fear. Even weakened, she was a predator, an apex hunter that could end him with one strike. But her eyes told a different story. They were clouded, glazed not by rage but by exhaustion, a haunting vulnerability that made her look almost human. Snowflakes drifted onto her body, forming a pale shroud, as though the tundra itself had already decided to take her away. The sharp buzz of his radio broke the silence. "Status," a voice cracked through the static. David pressed the button, his voice tight with urgency. "She's down, she's infested, barely breathing, we don't have much time." The words shook in his chest. He strained to hear the reply, but the wind roared like a living thing, drowning every syllable. Out here, it was just him and her, two beings caught in a fragile balance of fear and need. Suddenly, the bear shifted, her massive head lifting just enough to release a guttural sound that echoed over the ice. David flinched back, his heart pounding against his ribs. Her paw jerked forward weakly, claws scraping against the frozen surface. It wasn't an attack, it was a reflex, a final attempt at movement from a body collapsing under its own weight. The sight of the once mighty creature, trembling helplessly, carved into him deeper than any roar ever could.
He pressed one hand against the ice for stability, the cold searing straight through his glove. His breath quickened, not just from the danger, but from the raw, overwhelming weight of responsibility. She had been reduced from hunter to victim, and he was the only barrier between her and the final silence of the Arctic. Around them, the wind carried the scent of salt and blood, faint but undeniable, and it sent a shiver of dread up his spine. Something else might be near. Far on the horizon, the faint shape of another bear stirred, a silhouette pacing against the white wasteland. David's throat tightened. If it approached, drawn by the weakness of this dying female, the rescue would turn into a confrontation he wasn't prepared for. The ice groaned beneath his boots, echoing like a warning, amplifying his sense of isolation. He adjusted the strap of his emergency pack, knowing every second mattered. He leaned closer, his face inches from hers, watching her eyes flicker with fading awareness. "Hold on," he whispered, though his voice barely carried above the storm. A surge of determination coursed through him, cutting through the fear. He could see her ribs straining with each breath, the parasites crawling across patches of her bare skin where the fur had thinned. It was a grotesque sight, but more than that, it was a call he couldn't ignore. The sound of crunching snow snapped his head around. His team was nowhere in sight, but footsteps echoed faintly across the frozen ground. David's pulse raced, every nerve on edge. Was it his rescuers at last? Or another predator drawn by the smell of weakness? He tightened his grip on the tranquilizer gun slung at his side, the storm howling around him as man and bear hung together on the knife's edge of survival. The sound of crunching snow grew louder, each step carrying across the ice like a warning. David spun toward the shadow moving through the whiteout, his heart pounding so hard he thought the bear might hear it. Then, through the veil of snow, he recognized the familiar outline of Sarah Collins, one of his rescue partners, her parka hood rimmed with frost. Relief surged through him, but it was cut short when he realized she was alone. The rest of the team had been slowed by the brutal wind, leaving them even more exposed. Sarah dropped beside him, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of the polar bear's body, ravaged by parasites, her breathing shallow and erratic. "God, she's barely hanging on," she muttered, her voice breaking against the storm. David handed her a kit, his gloved fingers shaking, not from the cold, but from urgency. They began preparing sedatives and ointments, the bitter chemical smell of antiseptic filling the air, sharp against the raw scent of blood and salt. The bear let out a sudden guttural roar, weak but startling in the stillness, her massive frame jerking in protest. David stumbled back instinctively, but Sarah held her ground, her face set with iron determination. "She's fighting," Sarah said, her voice calm despite the danger. That fight, however faint, meant there was still something inside the bear worth saving. The storm pressed against them, rattling their gear, threatening to scatter their supplies across the ice. As David reached to apply the sedative, the bear's paw lashed forward, claws grazing the sleeve of his thick jacket. The rip of fabric split the air, sending a bolt of fear down his spine. His arm burned with the force of the blow, though the claws hadn't pierced through. He froze, his every instinct screaming to retreat. But then he caught her gaze again, clouded, trembling, not with malice, but with confusion. She was not trying to kill him, she was trying to hold on. Sarah shouted over the wind, "We can't wait for the others. If her organs shut down, she won't make it." David nodded, forcing his trembling hand forward, pressing the needle into her thick skin.
The bear groaned, her body twitching as the sedative began to take hold. For a moment, the tundra fell quiet except for the faint whistle of the wind and the sound of her breathing, fragile yet persistent. David's pulse finally slowed, though unease still coiled in his chest. The storm thickened, visibility dropping to only a few feet. Shadows flickered at the edge of their vision, and David's stomach turned as he remembered the other silhouette he had seen before Sarah arrived. He scanned the horizon, but now there was only white. The silence felt too heavy, too staged, as though something beyond the storm was watching them. Sarah's eyes darted nervously, mirroring his fear. They weren't alone out here. Then came the sound, deep, guttural, and far too close. Another polar bear, larger and stronger, emerged from the curtain of snow, its fur pristine and untouched, its eyes fixed on the weakened female lying between them. Hunger burned in its stare. David raised his tranquilizer gun, his frozen fingers trembling against the trigger. He knew it wasn't enough to stop such a beast. His breath caught in his throat, a primal fear gripping him as predator and rescuer locked eyes in the middle of the storm. The injured bear stirred at the presence of her rival, releasing a weak moan as though calling out for help. David felt something shift in his chest at that sound. It wasn't aggression, it was desperation. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was a battle to protect her from one of her own kind. The storm howled louder, the ice beneath them groaning under the weight of the confrontation. With Sarah clutching the medical kit and David aiming a weapon he knew might fail, the frozen tundra turned into an arena where survival hung by a single thread. The larger bear advanced, its paws thundering against the ice, each step deliberate, predatory. David's arm shook as he kept the tranquilizer gun leveled, aware of how little it would do against such raw power.
Sarah's breath came in short bursts, visible in the freezing air as she whispered, "Don't move." The injured female groaned faintly, her head barely lifting, the sound so fragile it sliced through the storm. That tiny plea tethered David to his decision. He couldn't abandon her now, no matter the risk. The predator stopped a few yards away, sniffing the air, nostrils flaring at the mix of blood, antiseptic, and human sweat. Its gaze shifted from David to Sarah, then back to the fallen bear. For a moment, time froze, the storm's howl fading into a void where only breath and heartbeat existed. David squeezed the trigger, the dart hissing through the air and striking the bear's thick shoulder. It roared, a deafening sound that rattled the ice, and for a terrifying heartbeat, David thought it would charge. But the tranquilizer worked faster than he dared hope. The bear staggered, its massive body swaying as though fighting gravity itself. It turned in confusion, teeth gnashing, then finally collapsed a few yards away, its chest rising and falling in heavy, sedated breaths. David fell to his knees, relief crashing over him like a wave. Sarah clutched his arm, her eyes glistening with the raw edge of fear and triumph. They had bought precious minutes, but the real work was still ahead. They bent over the collapsed female, working quickly. Sarah cleaned the oozing wounds where parasites had dug in, her hands steady despite the freezing burn of the air. David applied ointment, the stinging smell mixing with the iron tang of blood. Each groan the bear released pulled at their nerves, yet none were of aggression, only of pain, of a body surrendering to care it didn't understand. The intimacy of it struck David, touching the fur of a beast that should have killed him, but instead allowed him to fight for her survival. Hours bled together in the storm, their bodies numb from the cold, but slowly the bear's breathing steadied.
The violent shivers subsided, her chest rising in deeper, calmer rhythms. David brushed snow from her fur, his gloved hand lingering at her neck. For a fleeting second, her eyes opened, fixing on him. The gaze was faint, hazy, but it carried weight. Not predator to prey, not man to beast. Something different, something fragile. Trust flickered in that look. The rest of the team finally arrived, their headlights cutting through the blizzard like distant stars. They rushed in with blankets, heaters, and more medical supplies, but David hardly noticed them. He was locked in that moment, kneeling before a creature who had been abandoned by her strength, yet chose not to fight his. Sarah whispered, "She's gonna make it," her voice trembling with relief. The words warmed David more than the heaters could ever do. When it came time to move her, the bear shifted weakly, groaning as the team prepared the sled. David leaned close once more, his breath warming the frost around her muzzle. Without thinking, he pressed his bare hand against her fur, ignoring the sting of cold. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then, slowly, impossibly, her head lowered into his palm, as if accepting the gesture. A bond formed in that fragile contact, silent, yet louder than the storm. The team hauled her carefully toward safety, the sled creaking over the ice. David stood watching, his hands still tingling from the weight of her trust. Around them, the tundra had quieted, as though honoring what had just happened. In the endless white, man and bear had found something beyond survival, an understanding written in vulnerability and courage. As she disappeared into the veil of snow, David knew he would never forget that moment when a dying predator chose to rest in the hands of a man.